We have just heard a surprising story of two lives that converge. Yet, it's probably even more surprising that either of these women, Mary or Elizabeth, would receive any of our attention at all. Of course, in that culture, in that day, neither woman would have garnered much attention from anyone. That was sort of the way things were, but it's more than that as well. Elizabeth, the elderly barren woman, has been in isolation for the last 5 months. And Mary, as we're going to hear next week, was about to be sent away to her own kind of isolation by Joseph. And yet, God paid them attention. And in this, their lives truly converged. Now, Mary and Elizabeth were relatives, yes, but what truly brings them together is the role that they will play in God's story. As we know, these two are mothers who will nurture and give birth to John the Baptizer and Jesus, the Messiah. And as we consider the passing of this good news from generation to generation, as we have been looking throughout this Advent season, Mary and Elizabeth are the meeting points of many generations. You remember Mary is about to be wed into the ancient family line of King David. And Elizabeth carries a child who will usher in the voice of the prophets of old. And she reminds us of Sarah from even further back, who was well beyond childbearing years, who gave birth herself. And yet before Elizabeth's surprise pregnancy, and before the confounding news of Angel Gabriel to Mary, these two were nothing more than another reminder of what once had been, but no longer will be. A barren womb, and as Isaiah has it, the stump that was David's family tree. These two women hearkened thoughts of endings, not new beginnings. Now, I think it can be awfully easy, not only looking back to stories like that, but to our own time, to find the places where endings seem to abound. You don't have to look hard for them, and you have to be pretty optimistic or maybe even a bit naive to ignore all the endings that abound. Whether you look on the global scale or you look locally, it's not hard to find news that's troubling. It's not hard to find things that create concern for us, things that generate uncertainty, even things that might induce fear. The sorts of things that challenge our hopes for a better world. It doesn't seem like we've quite gotten to the point where the lion and the lamb lay at peace with one another, and I'm certainly not going to send Charles out to play over the snake's hole. But once we are fixated on those kinds of things, it can be awfully easy to lose sight that with God there is always a future. In fact, that's the story that we've heard here today. Mary and Elizabeth's lives converge as God brings forth new beginnings. As a prophet is conceived in Elizabeth's womb, and as a shoot comes forth from the stump of Jesse's line. As we have heard, God was bringing about a new beginning. It was Gabriel, the angel who showed up with the message greeting Mary, "Favored one, the Lord is with you." Gabriel affirmed to Mary that the story was not closed, but new life, Jesus, the hope of the world, would take shape within her womb. It's a beautiful story, It's unexpected. But I wonder, how often do we slow down to consider why we keep telling ourselves these stories? Year after year, we recount the stories of Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, shepherds, Herod, the wise men. But why do we keep telling ourselves these stories? There are many who would suggest we don't need to. Often people in my generation or younger, especially those who've been hurt by religion or left jaded by the church, there's a kind of cynicism that has emerged, and many seem to hope that we could just leave these old stories in the dust or put them up on the shelf, like we said earlier. Leave them to antiquity. Maybe we could find a pursuit of progress that comes from somewhere else. Maybe a better world would be possible if we looked in a different place. Just forget those old stories. There are others who disregard the power of these stories, and it's more common among those who spend time in the pews each Sunday. And that is to sentimentalize stories like this one. To hear the Christmas stories for the assurance that we're okay, the warm feelings that they provide, and only consider them for the comfort and assurance that they might offer us that we don't have to do anything, everything's okay. Those kinds of approaches may seem quite different, and yet they do the exact same kind of thing. They deny the power of how these stories can prepare us for God's work in the world, shaping us as people of hope here and now. Perhaps, as people of faith, we could find a more faithful way to take up these stories. And maybe we could find a good reason to keep telling them. For in these stories, in the stories of Mary and Elizabeth, we not only find what God did back then, but we find who God is, what God is still up to. In these stories, we encounter a God who makes beginnings out of what has come to an end. And as these stories take root in our hearts, they come alive, making us in our own time people of hope who can remember not only what God did once, but the kind of God who still is at work. In Mary and Elizabeth's story, we're reminded that the places that look like endings are the site of new beginnings. Those are the kinds of things that open us to what God is doing in the midst of this generation. Not simply what God did some time back for a previous one. And stories like this call us to consider our response to God's activity here and now. In our devotional materials, and if we have that slide, we can show that art here. Yeah, thank you. Artist Carmel Bogelin muses a bit about Mary in the creation of this piece. And I think it's helpful for us to consider here today. She writes this: "It's my speculation that the divinity of God enters Mary's body no sooner than Mary's yes went from her mouth." She continues, "In a time when women had few options other than marriage, Mary's consent to a potentially unwed motherhood is a brave act of subversive agency. In Mary's yes, we see the transformation of a young teenage girl from fearful to determined, from simply accepting to deciding, from passivity to agency, from betrothed to surrogate mother of God." End quote. What if we heard that this year? Not only as a nice story from of old that makes us feel good this Advent season, but as a call forth for our own yes to God and our own courageous act of agency on God's behalf in this world. Even if there are all sorts of things that may generate fear in us, all sorts of things that feel like supposed endings around us. Each year, in the midst of new and old fears and endless worst-case scenarios that we can probably devise in our heads, Advent is a chance for us to stop, to wait again. Time to remember and to be remembered within the story of a God who is with us, even in the midst of whatever fears would hold us back. What's possible for the ones who remember like that? What's possible for the ones who tell those kinds of stories again and again? In truth, I don't know the answer to that question, but we do well to linger with Gabriel's words to Mary. With God, all things are possible. Amen.